Act 2. The Attestation of King Futtehkhan. Ahmed and Abdul-Ahad carefully crept into the royal throne room of the palace. The throne room was teeming with ambient noise from the ensemble of royal abettors. Black and crimson curtains draped over the towering walls of the palace. The king's guardsmen grabbed Ahmed and Abdul-Ahad from behind and jostled the two men forward towards the throne. The guardsman towered over the two men. He stood just shy of 7 feet tall. The king sat upon the throne, perturbed by the onslaught of bad news from his subjects. His brow adorned a crown suited only for a king, a crown built of the lamentation of his people. Story after story, the king was subjected to ghastly tales of terror. The guardsman lazily loosened his stalwart grip and momentarily emancipated the two men, like a fisherman dehooking the catch of the day. He nudged the men closer to the throne and shouted, "All hail King Futtehkhan!" Ahmed whispered under his breath to his compatriot, "Bow your head and remember, let me do all the talking." Abdul-Ahad acquiesced to the sensible advice by slowly lowering down his head. As Abdul-Ahad lowered his head, he turned his gaze over to his self-assured companion. Ahmed gracefully lowered his waistline and showed his respect to the king. Ahmed bounced back up with the springiness of a kangaroo. As Ahmed elevated his chin, he purposefully locked eyes with the budding king. "I am Ahmed Fahad, son of Muhammad ibn Fahad, grandson of the great..." The dapper king dismissed Ahmed with a swift cumber flick of the wrist. His whimsical wrist waved like wind chimes swaying in the summer breeze. The guardsman resumed his diligent duties by pulling back Ahmed into the backdrop of the room. Simultaneously, the guardsman shoved Abdul-Ahad closer to the throne. The guardsman murmured under his breath a deep reverberating growl that echoed throughout the throne room. "So, my guardsman here tells me you bested a Sassanian in single combat. Quite impressive." Abdul-Ahad's legs joggled with anxiety, and he said, "If that is what he was, I did not know at the time, Your Majesty." "Modest too. How modest indeed," the king said while looking over to his entourage of agreeable advisors. The advisors were slender elder men of noble stature. Each man wore a dark robe that drooped to the floor. The king was young, but kept confidence in his elder tribesmen. From birth, these men were handpicked to advise the palace in various dealings. These men were renowned in the deadly art of politics, an art that Abdul-Ahad, son of a blacksmith, knew very little. "Your Majesty, not only did he best a Sassanian in single combat..." The king met Ahmed's interruption with a slight downward nod of the head and an upward raise of the eyebrow. His bushy dark brown eyebrows were elevated higher than the mounds surrounding Abdul-Ahad's village. The king's murky complexion was amplified by the wholesome radiance of the young man standing in front of him. The guardsman inched closer to the indefatigable Ahmed Fahad and growled under his breath once more. The guttural growl of the guard left a lasting linger with Ahmed, leaving an ineffable resonance on his imagination. Ahmed hastily abandoned his grandstanding for the time being. Apparently, he wasn't as famous as the king. The guard's rotund belly acted as a barrier between the king and his audience-goers. The refined curvature of the guard's belly resembled almost that of a pregnant woman. The hair from the man's forearms curled around his swollen forearms, like a form of natural cloth armor. His long black hair draped over his massive shoulders. "Now, tell me in your own words what happened. Do not fret formality here, Abdul-Ahad, son of Azim, grandson of Yoriz." I went to go explore the mountains around our village. All of a sudden, there was a chaotic thumping sound, and by the time I got back," Abdul-Ahad said while staring at the pristine floor of the throne room. The king made a hand gesture, beckoning for Abdul-Ahad to continue his tale of terror. One of the royal servants ascended the steps of the throne and presented a silver tray of delicacies. The king patiently perused the assortment of treats, scanning over the edibles with his hand. Abdul-Ahad was petrified with anxiety as the king nonchalantly browsed through the magnificent morsels. The king grinned at the sight of a fresh bowl of vine-ripened olives. He plucked the green olives from the bowl and flicked them into his mouth. One by one, he spat out the pits of the olive into a bowl. He resumed his prior hand gesture, inviting Abdul-Ahad to continue on with his story. My village was burned to the ground. These men, these monsters, they... Abdul-Ahad's forehead pulsated with blood. His face swelled with vitriolic anger. The veins on his forehead throbbed uncontrollably and spasmed like the stomach muscles of an Egyptian belly dancer. The king took notice of the sudden change in disposition. He placed the bowl of olives down gently back on the silver tray and began to wipe his hands with a crimson napkin. He curtly invited the young man to continue. And then, Your Majesty, they burned my village down to ashes. My home, my family, my everything, he said while clutching his balled-up hand. Who is they? King Futtehkhan asked with great interest. I found the 3 men responsible. And? I lost control of myself. I charged the men and was able to knock one to the ground. In the kerfuffle, I was lucky enough to wrestle away my blacksmith's hammer, and instinct took over from there. Yes, the instinct of a true warrior, an Afghan warrior, Ahmad said while walking around the throne room, boasting on behalf of his brethren. Ahmad jumped up on an empty chair and yelled to the crowd of nobles. Abdul-Ahad single-handedly defeated a Sassanian. As for the other 2 Sassanian dogs, they fled into the hills like cowards. The king reluctantly stood up from his throne and looked out of the nearest window. He pulled the curtain from the window and stared aimlessly into the valley. The view of the palace could see the better part of the valley and the voluptuous curvature of his land. So the reports were true. If they could make it this far north, all the way to the mouth of the Panjshir Valley, then they could just march up to our very doorstep. The king began to stroke his callow chin while pondering his options. All the while, his congregation of bureaucratic nobility whispered rumors of war. In Afghanistan, the longer the beard, the darker the beard, meant the greater the nobility. The throne room of the palace was congested with bearded elders vying for position, all yearning for a spot at the table, all eager to curry favor with the king, for war meant an opportunity to galvanize one's standing in history. Moments turned into minutes, minutes into an eternity. The king clasped his hands behind the swell of his back and said, War! All available men to arms! Spread the word to every village. Any man who can wield a weapon, any boy capable, we fight. The king's assembly started shouting in obnoxious anticipation for the looming war. The slender bureaucrats scurried around the courtyard, like the unknowing rats on a sinking ship. Ahmed looked on at the senseless display of bravado from the various tribal leaders in attendance. For Ahmed knew all too well the true cost of war, because he had paid it too many times before. Abdul-Ahad looked over at his unflappable companion, as a new look of dread turned him quite lugubrious. Ahmed began to pull his sleeves down to cover up his many calloused battle scars. Jagged cracks of discolored soft tissue covered his arms. He escorted his companion out of the throne room to the courtyard of the palace. Abdul-Ahad made quick haste as he approached the gates of the palace. The frenzied audience-goers clamored and flocked out of the palace, like a gaggle of geese scattering to the wind. One of the more discreet bureaucrats navigated through the crowd and meandered over to Ahmed. Ahmed Fahad? he asked with an unabashed tone of voice. Ahmed curtsied to the man and asked, "How may I be of service?" "Captain Ahmed Fahad?" Ahmed stood stoically as he sized up the brutish bureaucrat. Ahmed learned long ago, politics was not his strong suit. "The same captain that famously fended off the Macedonian siege of Kubal?" "That was a long time ago." "Indeed, but nonetheless, the kingdom requires your leadership once more. Do you answer the call?" "I gave that life up." The bureaucrat scoffed and said, "I am well aware of your accolades. We need your sword. We need your leadership. We need the famous Ahmed Fahad on the battlefield." "Then you are also well aware that I am no longer a captain." "Would you like to change that?" Ahmed Fahad slowly inhaled a breath of the dry Afghan air. He folded his arms as he mulled over the politician's promising proposition. "I answer the call," he said while extending his hand to the bureaucrat. The two men shook hands before parting ways. Ahmed followed his young companion into the bowels of the courtyard, heading toward the abounding gates of the palace. "Abdul-Ahad, your king calls on you to fight. Do you answer the call?" "I am no fighter. I am just a humble blacksmith. It is not my destiny, nor my place." Ahmed scoffed and continued his protestation of his newfound companion. "A mere blacksmith. A blacksmith who bested a Sassanian in armed combat, wielding nothing more than a hammer? No, son, you are no mere anything. You are a true warrior. I can feel it. I would bet my life on it." Ahmed began to strap the saddlebag across the hump of his camel. The leather of the saddlebag made a slapping sound as it bound to the camel. The bag took 2 hands to swing, and if not quickly secured, often slid off the hump. "If not to battle, where will you go?" Abdul-Ahad squirmed at the excoriating excruciation of the simpleton's question. I will go home. It is where I belong," he pouted proudly. "Home? Where is home exactly? Last time I checked, home is long gone." "I will rebuild. Abdul-Ahad said while his eyes uncontrollably began to water like tears in the rain. "Abdul-Ahad, the blacksmith?" "Yes, and what is so wrong with being a blacksmith?" "Nothing at all, but you are not just a blacksmith." "Maybe, but I am surely not a warrior." "There is a warrior in all of us, boy. There is a tempest in you, boy. I can feel it in my bones." Abdul-Ahad shook his ignoble crown and said, There is nothing in me. Nothing but regret." "Regret?" "If I was only there." "If only. You'd be dead too. Now, alive, here, you can make a difference." Abdul-Ahad gulped and tilted his head up towards the sky. A single tear rolled down his cheek as he continued packing. "Don't do it for the king. Don't do it for me. Don't do it for your country. Do it for your family. You owe them that much." "So says the great Ahmed Fahad." "I can teach you sword skills. I can teach you combat. What cannot be taught is that thing deep down inside of you. That vengeance, that rage, that power. You fight without fear. You fight for a higher calling. The heart of a true warrior is in you. Do you even know why you bested the Sassanian? Have you even asked yourself?" Abdul stopped dead in his tracks. He looked over his shoulder and said, "He was drunk, and I was lucky." "Drunk? Maybe he was. He stunk something awful when I found you. When you charged at him, his spirit crumbled like a wet piece of parchment paper. When you charge at a man, You expose his inner warrior spirit. If the spirit is weak, they flee. What you have inside you, that cannot be learned. It can only be unleashed. That makes you a dangerous man. I cannot. Ahmed sighed and said, We are born with our destiny ascribed to us at birth. From our first breath it is chosen. Sometimes we are destined for a path that we must walk alone. If I cannot convince you to serve your country, then at least come to the new recruit training tomorrow. The men could learn from your story. It could inspire them to do something brave. What they learn from your story might save a life. Abdul-Ahad looked at Ahmed and nodded in agreement.